So the next jurisdiction that we're going to hear from this morning is from the USA, and I'm going to introduce Tom Armstrong, but I will give you a teaser that we may have a surprise guest later on in the afternoon as well. So Tom Armstrong is a professor in the Department of Industrial Operations Engineering, Biomedical Engineering, and he's the director of the Center for Ergonomics at the University of Michigan. He received his degrees in aerospace engineering, industrial health, and a PhD in industrial health physiology and engineering from University of Michigan. And his current interests is the study of the relationships between repetitive work and musculoskeletal disorders. And he has been involved in many of the standards and initiatives around ergonomics in the USA. So he comes to us very well recommended and knowledgeable in what has been happening in our cousins south of the border. So I'd like to introduce Tom Armstrong. No.
Thank you, Richard. It's a pleasure to be here in Toronto on this nice sunny day. The way you referred to our surprise speaker this afternoon, I have to wonder if I'm being set up. Let me just say at the outset that I'm not a regulator. I have been involved in musculoskeletal disorders for many years and have occasionally worked with some of the regulatory agencies and been involved in several volunteer initiatives as well. When Richard first asked me to speak here today about current regulatory activities in the U.S., I thought you might just observe 45 minutes of silence and get an idea of what was going on. But that's probably a little bit cynical, and I don't mean to say that we need to try to over-regulate everything. But I do want to maybe back up a little bit and look at where we've been with some of these issues and the approaches that have been taken both in the past and today. And I made sort of a timeline here, and I keep fleshing this out a little more and more since we started talking about this meeting, Richard, and then even last night over dinner, and I got some more thoughts about it, and even this morning got up and made a few more tweaks. So this is probably going to look a little bit piecemeal. But having said that, let me just start out, talking about OSHA, which is really part of the Department of Labor in the U.S. and the major regulatory agency concerned with these issues. And there's really, from the day one when OSHA was created, there's really two provisions that have guided our approach to dealing with ergonomic problems, both at the federal level, and in some cases this is percolated down to the states, which have the option of developing their own regulations as long as they're at least as rigorous as the federal regulations. And of course, some of you will be familiar with the General Duty Clause, what we refer to as Section 5A1, that says that each employer shall furnish to each of his employees employment and places of employment which are free from recognized hazards that are causing or likely to cause death or serious physical harm to employees. And this has actually been used in a number of cases, particularly in the past, to cite employers for what are considered unsafe working conditions. And as we go through and look at some examples of this, we'll talk about some of the things that have been somewhat contentious on this. And as Richard mentioned, some of these slides will be put on the website. I've tried to include links with each of these, so if you want to go to the OSHA Department of Labor website, hopefully you can run down the original sources. The other aspect of the OSHA Act that's been used to cite employees to cite employees sounds, kind of high-handed, I guess, and I think the better way to refer to this has been used to really leverage employers to address these kinds of problems. So the second lever that OSHA's had to its disposal has been the record-keeping requirement. And this has morphed a little bit, and we'll talk a little bit about this, but there have been a number of record-keeping violations. And the most current provision of this says you're required to record work-related injuries and illnesses involving muscles, nerves, tendons, ligaments, joint, cartilage, and spinal disc in accordance with the requirement of applicable to any injury, illness under blah, 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 blah. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. Let's maybe look at where OSHA has been with this. And some of you may know that the Occupational Safety and Health Act was first implemented in the U.S. in 1970. And it really wasn't until 1978 that OSHA issued its first citation, or conducted an investigation, issued a citation related to ergonomics. And the recipient of that was the Eastman Kodak Company in Tennessee. Was received for primarily musculoskeletal disorders of the upper limb. And they were fined $4,300 US dollars, and had to agree to make some engineering and administrative changes to prevent those problems. There was another citation a year later of the Samsonite Corporation. Again, under the General Duty Clause, Samsonite was fined $16,000 and again had to agree to changes. And we saw a number of kind of minor citations like this, and I say minor, I'm talking in terms of the magnitudes of the penalties. In the 80s, as a result of a number of issues, OSHA started to up the ante on these things, and they actually came out with a new category of citation, which is referred to as an egregious willful citation. And this was applied most effectively in dealing with failures to report these problems under the record-keeping requirements. And essentially what OSHA discovered is that some employers were not reporting all these cases. There were cases where they were in fact being treated or being handled under the workers' compensation system, which implies that they are at least work aggravated, but yet they weren't being reported to OSHA. And since this was so prevalent, OSHA introduced this egregious willful provision, which allowed them to fine the employer for each infraction of the rule or each occurrence. And this parlayed penalties that heretofore had been in the ballpark of $4,000 to $16,000 up to $2.6 million, which really started to get people's attention in dealing with these kinds of problems. Chrysler was fined $295,000 for record keeping. John Morrell, 69 record-keeping violations, was fined not 680%, but $680,000. Ford Motor Company was cited $476,000 for record-keeping. John Morrell was later fined again for a second offense, this time for $4.3 million. IBP fined $3 million, and on and on and on. Now, usually these penalties were used, again, as levers. Most of them were settled for much less, but the companies, in fact, would agree to corporate-wide settlement programs, which, between the Department of Labor and the labor representatives for those. So labor actually played an important role in representing the interest of workers and dictating what the settlement agreement and program would be like. Excuse me. And sorry, I'm losing my voice suddenly. I'll talk a little bit more about the architecture of these programs, but in a few minutes. But they tend to be involve workers. They involve surveillance. They involve both risk factor surveillance in a proactive mode and health surveillance in a reactive mode, management of restricted workers, job improvements, and ongoing evaluations. In fact, the program that was agreed to by General Motors, and in fact more or less became a poster child for the ergonomics as OSHA got into talking about a record key or developing an ergonomic standard in the 1990s. It was ultimately implemented in around 2000. This is an example of a typical settlement or citation settlement. It says $500,000 annually for 5 years will be spent by Crane and Company to reduce and eliminate ergonomic hazards at 11 of its facilities nationwide. The company agrees to spend money under an agreement settlement with the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. So again, OSHA really wasn't interested in using this as a way to generate money for balancing the federal budget, but again, getting the employers to deal with these issues and implement programs and control their problems. And you know, by doing these programmatic approaches, they really tailored the programs to fit the needs of that particular industry at those particular sites and for those particular work populations, all of which can vary significantly from one place to another. In 1981, OSHA published Ergonomics, the Study of Work, as part of a nationwide education outreach program. In 1981, more than 30 labor organizations petitioned the Secretary of Labor in the U.S., which I believe then was maybe John Pendergrass, to issue an emergency temporary standard. OSHA begins a specialized emphasis inspection program on ergonomic hazards in the meat processing industry in 1982. 1992, the Secretary of Labor declined to issue an emergency standard primarily because they felt the general duty clause and the record-keeping requirements were probably adequate for that point. But OSHA did publish an advance notice in 1992 of developing a rulemaking process for dealing with ergonomics. Now, we just heard about how the British Columbia standard evolved over 6 years, and analogies to making sausage. I would have to say it's at least as brutal in the U.S. Starting in 1982 with a proposal, something didn't emerge until 2000, and as many of you know, it was very short-lived at that point. So that's 8 years, and then it only got repealed very quickly. But along the way, the National Academy of Science was actually commissioned to do a study looking at the science behind the relationship of work activity and musculoskeletal disorders. They commissioned one study in 1989. The director of the National Academy of Sciences actually fast-tracked that, and I was involved with that activity at that time, and we were actually able to complete the review in 6 months, which actually substantiated the relationship between musculoskeletal disorders and different kinds of work activities. The critics of the process weren't satisfied with that, so they asked for a second study. That study was completed over 2 years and published in 2001, and came to the similar kinds of conclusions after looking at perhaps a broader collection of references and visiting more work sites. I think the lesson from this is that people have a very high burden of proof for things that they don't want to do, and as I always maintain, this is a little bit like arguing with your kids about cleaning up their room or trying to get them to mow the grass. They always come back with reasons why they don't work. And while there's a lot of compelling literature here about things that you can do to control musculoskeletal disorders, none of it's perfect, and people can always look at it, and some people will say the glass is half full, and we can build on this and do something with it, and other people will say the glass is half empty and we shouldn't commit any resources. So again, there's lots of wiggle room in how we interpret these things. The bottom line is that OSHA did come out with an ergonomic standard in 2001. This was a several hundred-page monster by many accounts that really provided an extensive amount of background material. and specific guidance about setting up programs, analysis of jobs, and even some of the abatement procedures. I think, in retrospect, they probably really kind of overreached with this, trying to address everybody's concern, and the result was that they ended up with something that was really complex and intimidating, and as again many of you know, the House and Senate in the U.S. exercised their oversight authority and actually repealed the standard in 2001. And not only did they repeal the standard, but they also enacted legislation that would prevent OSHA from considering another standard in the future. So we're pretty much stuck with the general duty clause and the record-keeping requirements as a way of addressing ergonomics at the federal level until Congress feels compelled to come up with a new law, and I don't think that's really going to happen in the current political climate that we have today, which it tends to be rather anti-regulation. In 2002, trying to defuse some of the criticisms that OSHA wasn't taking care of or wasn't addressing ergonomic issues, then Director of Labor, Elaine Chao, announced that OSHA was going to develop a comprehensive program for dealing with ergonomic injuries. The plan included no specific regulations, but it did include the so-called four-pronged approach, which included industry-specific and task-specific guidelines, outreach activities, enforcement, and research. In terms of guidelines, over the last 8 years, OSHA has developed 4 sets of guidelines. These have been developed through what they refer to as their alliance program, working with industries and trade groups, such as American Apparel and Footwear Association and National Telecommunications Safety Panel and other organizations like that, the grocery store organizations, meat processors, the poultry processors. And they developed specific guidelines for nursing home industry, retail grocery stores, poultry processing, and shipyards. So, to their credit, they have come back with some specific guidelines. And these were developed with a lot of input from people working in those industries. They've developed, and you can find the documentation of this on the OSHA website, 71 strategic partnerships with emphasis on ergonomics, 19 alliances, and 40 at national level and 40 regional area offices that have developed, basically training and awareness kinds of documents. They've enhanced their website. They provided some training materials. They've developed some memorandum of understanding that basically says they're going to work together in a positive kind of way in some of these kind of problems. And they have provided a little bit of money for training managers and employers on these issues. There's also been the formation of a 15-member National Advisory Committee on Ergonomics with representatives from industry, academia, labor, legal, and medical professions. They've developed recommendations based on discussions of task-specific guidelines, and these are the guidelines that I just referred to. OSHA, again, one of their components is mentioned as enforcement. Over the last 8 years, ostensibly they've issued 19 general duty clause or citations for violations of ergonomic hazards. 18 of these have been settled. They don't say how they were settled, and there's one that actually remains open. I couldn't help but contrast this in the previous presentation where I heard I think there had 200 actions per year versus 18 over 8 years in the U.S. So it's an interesting statistic. From January 1, 2002 through January 31st, 2007, OSHA conducted over 4,000 ergonomic inspections, encompassing a variety of industries. Many of these were of nursing homes, which was considered a priority area. They've sent out some 593 hazard alert letters telling employers that they think they got a problem, they ought to do something about it. When OSHA uses the general duty clause to cite employers, there are 4 critical elements to this. First, they have to show that the employers have failed to keep a workplace free of recognized hazards. There's often been some debate about what is a recognized hazard. For some people, heavy lifting is considered a recognized hazard. For other people, don't consider that, and that gets argued in the settlement agreements. Whether the hazard is causing or likely to cause death or serious physical harm. And this has also been kind of a contentious issue because, we say death or physical harm. Some people imply that that means that you're at risk of being dismembered or, having some kind of permanent injury, and, musculoskeletal by some standards doesn't raise to the level of serious physical harm. The hazard was recognized, and then the last one, which is probably the most critical one, is that there's a feasible means of abatement for that hazard to exist. And this is probably probably the most delicate area that OSHA has to tread with on these kinds of citations, because each of these situations is unique, and it's very difficult to do controlled studies where you show definitively that these changes have resulted in fewer injuries. We can show that we've eliminated some of the stresses in many cases, but that doesn't necessarily translate automatically to a change in morbidity, which sometimes can take several years to evaluate. And as many of you know, workplaces tend to be pretty dynamic, both in terms of the workers doing these jobs and also the kind of work activities that are being performed. So it's just not a good environment for doing that kind of research. At the same token, I think this is a special burden for maybe the academic community, is to try to find these situations or to work with the people in compliance and in industry to find places where they can do rigorous evaluations and show some of the things that do work. And we shouldn't take it for granted. What sometimes seems like it's going to work doesn't. And I don't know if you can read the caption on that print, but you can see the guy standing there looking at his socks, and they're kind of chained together, and his wife's saying, "Oh, that's so I can keep your socks paired up in the laundry." I don't know how many of you do laundry, but some of you at least have probably experienced the problem of trying to get the right socks matched up with the right ones so you don't get out of bed in the morning and put on a gray one and a black one, and then people look at you at work and wonder how you got dressed that morning. Along with this period during the early part of this new millennia, not only did we see kind of a different approach in how OSHA's dealing with the ergonomics, but they actually went back and nullified many of the settlement agreements that were developed in the 90s. And they also developed a new record-keeping requirement, the OSHA 300 forms. And I read you the reporting criteria on this earlier, but basically they've provided forms for people to record this information and check off the appropriate boxes. Now, this reporting is really important part of management of these problems, because as much as I'd like to stand here and tell you that we want to deal with everything in a proactive mode, and I can walk into a workplace, or other people can walk into a workplace and they can use RULA or REBA or Strain Index or HAL or the NIOSH Work Practices Guide or SNOOK tables and identify all the problems and address these problems, prevent all these problems occurring in advance. The reality is that none of these systems are perfect, and we're going to be stuck with a situation, I think, probably for the foreseeable future, where some of these cases are going to slip through the cracks, and we have to have a way to identify them. Now, the good news is that we aren't dealing with the kind of problems that people die from. It's not to say that they don't create substantial pain and discomfort and serious disability, and they aren't a big burden. But there's a growing body of literature that in fact shows that we can manage these cases. This is, of course, what we refer to as secondary prevention. So it's really important that we look at these morbidity patterns and we see if there are any trends that are showing up where one job might be at greater risk than another. And this is just a sample table just illustrating, from a plant over 6 months with something on the order of 114 workers in production areas of the plant. If we actually go back and calculate incident rates, how those incident rates vary from 0 to upwards of 66 cases per 100 workers per year. So the point is that these cases aren't equally divided between, or equally distributed across all work activities, and some work activities do distinguish themselves and merit immediate attention. Similarly, with working in offices, there's a good deal of data that shows that working at keyboards for more than 6 hours a day is associated with increased risk versus using them for less time per day. So this record keeping is really a critical component. Even though it's not proactive, it still helps us identify problems. Again, but the conclusions from this these kinds of analyses are only as good as the data that go in. Of course, we say garbage in, garbage out, and if people aren't keeping those data, then or taking the record keeping seriously, then we won't be able to identify those problems. And this, of course, is a sensitive issue with OSHA and with industry. And the OSHA, as one of their alliances with the National Association of Manufacturers, actually has developed some language about record keeping, particularly with respect to musculoskeletal disorders. And I won't read this to you, but I think the bottom line is that it still gives employers a great deal of latitude about what's reported. And ostensibly, the way that's addressed is by getting an expert medical opinion, but I can tell you that there's also a lot of variations depending upon which medical expert you consult with in the U.S., and I suspect that's true in Canada as well. So again, this system is far from perfect, and maybe there's the bottom line here is that we can only go so far in mandating or trying to micromanage these kinds of problems. People have to want to address them, and we have to find ways of motivating that. Now, OSHA has come back and recently did settle a record-keeping citation against Caterpillar in Peoria, Illinois, and this just was in the last 6 weeks. An administrative law judge with the Occupational Safety and Health Review Commission in Denver has affirmed, and other than serious, this is kind of a contrast from what we saw in the 90s when OSHA was issuing these egregious citations for multi-million dollars and then leveraging them into corporate settlement agreements. In this case, this was classified as an other than serious safety citation, and Caterpillar was fined $900 for failing to report some cases of epicondylitis. I can tell you that they spent a lot more than $900 litigating this, and the UAW, which actually worked with the workers to identify the cases that weren't reported, also put a lot more time into it than that. But everybody, of course, was concerned with the precedents that this actually established. And even though it was settled against Caterpillar, Caterpillar has filed an appeal, so we'll have to wait and see where this ends up. Okay, and I already mentioned OSHA has canceled the existing settlement agreements from the 90s. Now, having said that, I should just maybe add that even though they went back and canceled the legal requirement from the Department of Labor standpoint, many of these have agreements with their labor union. So, for example, companies like Ford and GM have agreements with the UAW. Will be continuing those programs. Moving on from federal OSHA, we have at least one state that has an ergonomic standard. The state of California, which is really one of the earlier people on the scene with this, in 1996 issued a standard that provides that when at least 2 employees performing identical tasks have been diagnosed by a physician with repetitive motion injuries, RMIs, within 12 consecutive months, the employer must establish a program which shall basically evaluate each job, control or minimize the extent of feasible exposures, provide training to affected employers, and provide further inspections. I can remember when this was first proposed, this was referred to as the two-page kind of superficial standard, somewhat sarcastically. And interesting enough, it's one of the few pieces of ergonomic legislation in the U.S. that has actually survived and is still being used today. So, you know, I mean, I think there's something to be said for sometimes something that's very, very simple. So sometimes less can be more. I've heard earlier, we heard about the State of Washington initiative, and the State of Washington actually had a very elaborate process to develop ergonomic standard with a series of toolboxes for identifying problems. They passed the standard in 2001. This was just after the federal OSHA standard had been passed and actually revoked. There was a lot of concern about this on the part of industry, and the National Association of Manufacturers and the Chamber of Commerce actually lobbied voters in the state of Washington very hard that this was going to result in erosion of jobs and make the state of Washington uncompetitive with other states. And it was actually rescinded through a general election in 2003. The Department of Labor and Industries in the state of Washington continues to be very active in research and developing tools, ergonomic tools, which are used by Washington employers and workers, and by employers and workers from many other states as well. So even though their standard didn't survive, their research initiative and service activities have, and provided a valuable resource for the rest of the country and, for that matter, the rest of the world. The state of Michigan recently went through a standard-setting process, and it ended up kind of this, didn't get quite as far as the state of Washington. It was actually the state House and Senate voted to ban or forbid the Department of Labor from adapting a standard, shortly before it was to go in and take an effect. And in this case, they didn't even want recommendations. So, as far as we can tell, it's pretty much dead. Our new governor, Rick Snyder, says he wants to stop what he calls overreaching ergonomic regulations. Moving on, and several other states have gone through this, and I won't drag you through all those kind of details. Many of you are familiar with the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. NIOSH is not a regulatory agency, of course. It is responsible for, it's actually part of the Center for Disease Control, and it's responsible for doing research and education. Many of you are familiar with the 1981-1991 work practices guides. This is 1991, I should actually say initially it was 1981, that developed recommended lifting limits based upon the location of the work, how far somebody was lifting something, and the frequency of the lifting. And essentially they started out with a 226 Newton or 51 pound load and would discount it based upon how far away from the ideal lifting location it was, how far they actually had to lift it, and the frequency. In 1983, it was revised to include an asymmetry factor and a coupling factor or multiplier, because people often do asymmetrical lifting and sometimes they can't get a good grip on things. Neither of those are regulations. At one time it was talked about that they would be used with the general duty clause. There's been a lot of concern about this on the part of industry, that this is sort of a backdoored standard setting process. So OSHA's kind of treaded fairly gently with using those, but they certainly do get used a lot by employers to evaluate work sites. I don't know how many of you are familiar, well actually let me ask a question, how many people are familiar with ACGIH International? Okay, good, most of you. I think ACGIH is an interesting venue. ACGIH was actually created in the late 1940s. Originally you had to be a member of, you had to work for the government, you couldn't be affiliated with labor or industry to be part of ACGIH. And the idea was to develop a group of people, safety and health professionals who ostensibly were neutral and weren't biased by labor interest or industry interest, who could look at the literature and make recommendations about what were considered safe work exposures based upon the best data that were available. And I suspect many of you actually have, it used to be a little pocket guide, and it's gotten to be a little bigger now. It's a spiral guide, and you can still get it in your pocket if you've got a big pocket. But I would encourage you to pull it out and take a look at the preambles to this, because they actually have a lot of useful background information. Basically, TLVs are based on available information from industrial experience, from experimental human and animal studies, and when possible from a combination of the three, as cited in their documentation. So there's a companion volume to this that explains where the information came from. These limits are intended for use in practice of occupational hygiene that should be interpreted and applied only by persons trained in these disciplines. So the expectation is that people are going to understand, kind of the limitations of these things, and they're not going to be applied indiscriminately or naively. They're not intended for use in evaluation and control levels of physical agents in the community, or as proof or disproof of an existing disability. So in other words, while an ACGIH has, for example, recently come out with guidelines for material handling, this would apply for industrial population working in an industrial setting, as opposed to somebody working in their yard doing yard work who might occasionally do this and have a different kind of physiology. With respect to proof or disproof an existing disability, they don't serve as proof or disproof, but certainly they are occasionally used to determine whether or not somebody had a substantial exposure, which of course is a critical issue in determining work-relatedness. One of the neat things about the TLVs is that they're reviewed annually, as opposed to government standards, which OSHA hasn't approved a new safety and health standard in some time, and when they do, it really requires a review by the Congressional Budget Office on cost-benefit analysis, and includes public commentary, and it's extremely expensive and demanding process for OSHA to implement a standard, whereas ACGIH can look at their guidelines each year and make new recommendations based upon data that come along. The TLVs are not considered consensus standards, and this is sometimes difficult for people to understand. Again, they try to create people who they don't think are biased, or at least can manage their biases, and they make the best recommendations they have. And people have the freedom to accept them or reject them. These aren't standards; they're just recommended exposure limits. ACGIH in 2000 came out with a statement about musculoskeletal disorders. They said they recognize work-related musculoskeletal disorders as an important occupational health problem. The term musculoskeletal disorder refers to chronic muscle, tendon, and nerve disorders caused by repeated exertions, rapid motions, high forces, contact stresses, extreme posture, vibration, or low temperature. And this was actually, it came out in advance of developing specific TLVs for hand activities and for material handling. And it was kind of a way of putting a stake in the ground, saying that this is something that we're going to deal with. Other commonly used terms for musculoskeletal disorders include cumulative trauma disorders, repetitive motion illnesses, repetitive strain injuries. Some of these disorders fit established diagnostic criteria such as carpal tunnel syndrome or epicondylitis. Others are very nonspecific and may just simply be manifest by nonspecific pain. They also recognize that some transient discomfort is a normal consequence of work and is unavoidable, but discomfort that persists from day to day or interferes with activity of work or daily living should not be considered an acceptable outcome of work. And towards that end, they proposed a TLV for monotask hand work based upon the repetitiveness of the job and the required peak forces. And they also developed a recommendation for lifting. And their basically recommendation for lifting is applies to workplace lifting conditions under which it is believed nearly all workers may be repeatedly exposed day after day without developing work-related low back pain and shoulder disorders associated with repetitive lifting. Individual organizational risk factors that may influence the likelihood that an individual will experience low back pain and shoulder disorders. Two-handed mono-lifting task with 30 degrees of sagittal plane motion. And then they go on to explain this and provide some tabular data for determining acceptable limits. Another tool that sometimes gets used is the Liberty mutual or stover snook lifting, manual materials handling. These are based upon psychophysical studies that were conducted going back to the early 60s. And the static U of M static strength program is another variation based on more rigorous biomechanics. A couple other standards I should just mention are guidelines. American National Standards Institute tried to, I shouldn't say ANSI tried to, but we tried to, through the National Safety Council and the ANSI accreditation process, develop a consensus standard. After 10 years, we basically gave it up as being intractable. Workers' compensation rules create incentives for employers to manage these kinds of problems. We have an Americans with Disability Act, which has had a little bit of impact, but not much. And then organized labor has been a big issue. There's also what I like to think of as social conscience or the moral high ground, which ought to be a selling point for these problems. Now, the last point, let me just jump up here and say, maybe by way of closing, a couple of points. Again, there's a lot of wiggle room in how we interpret data. Some people can say the glass is half full or half empty. Experience between the 90s and the early part of this millennia have shown that there's a broad range of actions that people can do, take that are consistent with the laws and regulations, and they're very different. So I think it's worth just kind of maybe in conclusion reflecting on what are some of the reasons why we should think about ergonomic programs. We talked about trying to sell these things to industry, and I always like to start saying it's the right thing to do. I know we've got a lot of people here who specialize in safety and health, and I suspect most of you went into this business because it was an opportunity to help people and not because you saw it as an opportunity to get OSHA off somebody's back. But having said that, if the moral high ground doesn't appeal to people, there is big bad OSHA out there that can exert some leverage. Also, there's organizations like Americans with Disability Act and workers' compensation groups. You can tell people they're going to have to do this anyway. You can tell them that it's going to improve their productivity. You can tell them it's going to improve their quality. It's going to improve worker relations. It's going to help them attract quality workers and retain quality workers. I don't know, is anybody here old enough to remember when Borden's advertised milk from contented cows? I grew up on a dairy farm, and I can remember my dad milking the cows and rubbing the cows' back. How often do you see employers kind of rubbing workers' backs like that? And I'm speaking figuratively here, not literally. But somehow, we get much more adversarial often, it seems like, with workers. So anyway, there's some reasons to try to make the job better. We can reduce our medical and workers' compensation cost, and we can improve the company image. Some people market these kind of programs. It's also very compatible with current Six Sigma kind of technology of setting goals and trying to solve them, or the DAMIC process, and some people sell this as an opportunity. Now, if you're going to tell people the reasons for doing this, you better be prepared to hear their excuses and try to develop some arguments to the contrary. So some people say we're not convinced we have a problem. Some people say ergonomics and human trauma disorders are fads. If we can just kind of bear this out, it'll go away. It costs too much. It's not in this year's budget. We don't have time. It's kind of a circular argument here. If you got the time, you don't have the money. If you got the money, you don't have the time. We plan to change the jobs next year. I mean, I've seen this go on for year after year after year. We plan to automate. We plan to move south. If you're in the U.S., if you're in Michigan, you're going to move to the southern part of the country. If you're in the southern part of the country, you're going to move offshore. If you move offshore, you start out in the Caribbean, then you work your way to the Pacific Rim, and so on and so forth. Let's see. That's what we have. That's the way we've always done it. We've never had these problems before. The dog never died before either. We need a quick fix. We're not concerned with long-term gains. We think the problem's due to the union. We think the problem's due to the workers. We think the problem's due to the government regulations. We think the problem's due to anybody but us. We don't want to encourage complaints. Workers should be grateful for jobs, no pain, no gain. This is due to a few crybabies. This is a union agenda. We don't have time or room for restricted workers. We want to screen out workers at risk. Workers know what to do. They just won't do it. We don't want to pamper workers. We think this is a psychogenic problem. Anything we can't understand is a psychogenic problem. These are not work-related problems. Ergonomics is not an exact science. Well, tell me what in the management business is. give me proof. Again, there's that high burden of proof. We tried it once, it didn't work. Therefore, nothing works. They're afraid this is going to slow us down. We don't know how to implement a program. That's what insurance is for. We think this is going to result in a speed up, and basically, I don't want to. You notice there's about twice as many excuses as there are reasons for doing it. So, in conclusion, new regulations will be difficult in the present ergonomic and political climate. Experience shows that agencies have a lot of latitude in how they interpret and apply the existing regulations. MSDs continue to be a big problem for employers. Research and education are needed to develop and disseminate both general and specific work design solutions for preventing musculoskeletal disorders in the workplace. Future regulatory actions could clarify record keeping and general duty requirements. Guidelines for professional groups such as ACGIH are helpful, and good luck.
We have time just for a couple of quick questions. Anybody? Go ahead, just shout from where you are.
Okay. Tom, you mentioned that at the beginning some examples of the companies that were fined for OSHA infractions. I'm wondering, do the companies have an opportunity to try to comply before they get fined, before they're sort of an administrative penalty is levied on them, or how does that work?
Can you repeat the question?
Okay, the question is, do companies have an opportunity to comply before they actually get fined? And I think they have lots of opportunity, but once the OSHA inspector is there, then they're going to conduct their investigation, and if they find, it's a little bit like once you get pulled over by the cops for speeding, you've got plenty of time to slow down until the police officer pulls you over, or you got plenty of time to get your taxes straightened out until you get audited. But once they start doing their investigation, they'll probably continue to move towards deciding whether to cite or not cite. Now, having said that, I mean, this is the way it was in the 90s. As I indicated, when if we look at the situation since 2000, where we've only had 19 citations over 8 years, they did write 500 letters, telling employers that they thought there was a problem, and theoretically, if the employers ignored those letters, they could go back and cite them. So I guess that's maybe moving in the direction you're suggesting.
Yes, Vince Bailey, Canadian Auto Workers. When GM and Ford and Chrysler got fined, did they notice an improvement after the fine? Or have they got fined since?
In some cases, yes. In some cases, no. With respect to the improvements, it's really hard to track these things because a lot of times the record keeping was really poor to start with, and then as you move towards implementing a program, the first thing that happens is you just start to discover that there are a lot more claims there, or there are a lot more problems than what you realized at the beginning. So you issue the citation, and suddenly the number of reported claims goes up, and people say, "Gee, we've just set up, we've just put up a lightning rod that's tracking all these problems." But the more important measure, I think, of the success of the program is to what extent they're actually controlling the disability. So, or in other words, are we reducing the severity of these kinds of problems? What you'd like to see is to see an increase in the reporting, but a decrease in the number of claims that actually require medical attention, or a decrease in the amount of lost time associated with each of those claims. In that sense, yes, the companies have seen their workers' compensation cost and their medical disability decrease.